Okay. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad that we're not so numerous, but our main participants are here. And before we start, I would like to welcome our guests from Albania, North Macedonia, Serbia, and Montenegro, who have arrived precisely because of the project that we have with the various ministries of the Western Balkans. Now, this morning's session is dedicated to European Union's enlargement to the Western Balkans and lessons learned from the new EU member states. And of course, I think that this morning's session is inevitably multidisciplinary because we cannot talk about the Western Balkans and about problems of EU enlargement without taking into account political aspects, historical aspects, economic aspects. And in fact, I'm very pleased that on our panel today, we have political scientists, historians, legal experts, and also economists. I'm an economist, but I will try not to bore you with too many statistics, economic statistics. So this morning, we have a long session. We will touch upon various issues, starting from current challenges deriving from unresolved political problems, the return of authoritarian regimes, weak rule of law, corruption, reconciliation, low levels of development, experience gained in the other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm really pleased that on today's panel, I have some of the best experts for the Western Balkans. It's an excellent panel that will be discussing these issues. Now, after my presentation that will introduce the topic of EU enlargement to the Western Balkans, we will actually have seven speakers. But I suggest that we have a short break after four presentations, otherwise it will be too long. We will first have Professor Jovan Teokarevic from the University of Belgrade, who was supposed to be here with us, but unfortunately was not able to join because of the newest restrictions. And he will be talking about the problem of de-democratization in the Western Balkans. Then we will have Jelena Jankic from the European University Institute in Florence, who will explain the notion of the captured state in the Western Balkans. Then there is a colleague of mine at the London School of Economics, Will Bartlett, who will be telling us something about the link between international assistance and corruption in the Western Balkans. This will be followed by Luca Pieroni, my colleague from Perugia, who will reflect on the link between corruption and firm competitiveness. Then we will have Stefano Bianchini, who is from the University of Bologna, who has worked on the Western Balkans for over 30 years, and who will tell us something about the problems of reconciliation and other issues which are still on top of the agenda in the Western Balkans. And then we will also have Roxana Bratu. Some of you listened to her. We met her yesterday from the University of Sussex, who will tell us something about the challenges of anti-corruption in EU enlargement. Last but not least, there's my colleague Fabio Raspadori, who will tell us something about the request of the Union, and I'm sure you will be reflecting on some of the recent problems linked to the new member states from Central and Eastern Europe. Now, since we have a very long morning, I would ask all panelists to try and speak for no longer than 15 minutes. 15 minutes, so we can leave some time for discussion at the end, and perhaps questions from the audience. So at this point, I will immediately start and upload my own presentation. Full slide. Can you see it? Yes. All right. Well, I will start by trying to give an overview of the problems in the Western Balkans. It went ahead. An overview of the problems in the Western Balkans. And here we have to start by stating that in fact...
Sorry, Milice, we can't see the presentation.
You can't see the presentation.
You have to upload.
No. Okay, thank you, Johan. I don't know what I did wrong.
Adesso dobbiamo prima andare qua. Ok.
So it's been practically 30 years, it's been 20 years since the EU launched its stabilization and association process for the Western Balkans immediately after the conflict in Kosovo. And actually tried to apply a certain procedure that was very similar to what was done for the Central East European countries a decade earlier. The Western Balkans were offered financial assistance through various specific packages. They were offered trade liberalization. They were offered technical assistance in order to be able to adopt laws in conformity with the acquis communautaire. And they were even offered the perspectives of entering the European Union, and this was done at the very important summit in Thessaloniki in 2003. So somehow, if we look at the measures that the EU has used vis-à-vis the Western Balkans, we see that they were in fact similar to those that it has used in Central and Eastern Europe, but unfortunately, under more stringent conditions, much stricter conditionality. And we also see that the overall results of all these measures have been highly disappointing. So regarding political integration, we see that the results have been very limited. Only Croatia was able to join the European Union, and only in 2013, 12 years after it had signed the Stabilization and Association Agreement. The other countries are in different stages of their integration process. Montenegro and Serbia are presently negotiating EU accession. Albania and North Macedonia are EU candidates, but they should be starting soon. It's been blocked for too long. They're certainly ready to start their negotiations, and it's a matter of days or months before some of the open questions are resolved. And we have also Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, who are still potential candidates, and unfortunately there's been little progress regarding these two countries, also due to the fact that they have specific constitutional problems. Regarding economic integration, on the other hand, this has gone actually quite fast. There has been fast integration with the European Union, but with variable results. There has been gradual integration into the EU economy during the early 2000s through increasing trade, foreign direct investment, financial and banking integration, and the EU has become the most important economic partner of the Western Balkan countries in every sense. And there is no doubt that this increasing economic integration between the Western Balkans and the European Union has helped these countries in economic recovery, in implementing fundamental economic and institutional reforms. But strong integration has then also rendered these countries vulnerable to external shocks. So once the global financial and economic crisis hit the European Union, we see that these countries were also very much hit, negatively affected by the crisis. And we see that after 2009, all these countries have had notable slowdowns in economic growth or even several recessions. So coming to the present moment, what has happened in the meantime, unfortunately, we have to say that the processes of democratization have been relatively slow, even after 2001, when we see a major turnaround and a different climate, and for various reasons. And of course, it is not easy to give a simple explanation, but I think that we must start from the legacies of the 1990s. Namely, we have to recall that this region has had 5 military conflicts, nationalistic policies. There were international sanctions against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. There was the NATO bombing. There were networks of illegal trade, criminality, corruption, developed during long years of isolation of the region. And these legacies have certainly left very deep traces on the Western Balkan societies, on their political systems, on political culture, and are proving very difficult to dismantle. Then we have to consider that we had further disintegration processes. Of course, Yugoslavia disintegrated in 1991, but then there was this definite split between Montenegro and Serbia. Then there was the proclamation of independence on the part of Kosovo in February 2008. And one of the problems that remains is that Kosovo is still not recognized officially by 5 EU member states and also by some 40% of UN members. There has also been no progress with a number of unresolved bilateral issues, and particularly the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, despite the mediation of Madame Mogherini, who has tried to push ahead certain key issues. Unfortunately, there's been very little progress in this sense. In the meantime, we have also seen political instability in most of these countries due to local political crisis, due to corruption scandals, tendency towards more authoritarian regimes, erosion of democracy. In fact, I think some of the later speakers will talk more about this. And then there are also long-lasting unresolved constitutional problems, especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Kosovo. And another feature we must mention are weak institutions. There are serious rule of law issues due to insufficiently reformed judiciary, inefficient public administration, diffusion of corruption, low quality and corrupted media, efforts to silence critical voices, non-transparent policy making, and limited consultations with civil society organizations. If we add to this politicians' ambiguity regarding foreign policy stances, we see that, in fact, many politicians are very much officially in favor of joining the EU, but also welcome good relations with China, with Russia, with the Arab Emirates, and so on. And so in this climate, it's been 30 years since these countries are waiting to be able to enter the EU. We see that there is this very slow pace of EU integration and also heavy external involvement in Bosnia and Kosovo, plus the multiple crises that the European Union has been facing in recent years, has led to diminished attractiveness of the EU and also to declining popular support of the EU in some of the Western Balkans. And here I have prepared a few graphs just to show you how these countries stand regarding the rule of law. Not incidentally, I have also added Italy because I assumed that yesterday we would have a day of many complaints about the situation in Italy. So just know that Italy is better than most of the Western Balkan countries. These are country ranks according to the World Bank governance indicators, indicating, in fact, that the Western Balkans have much weaker rule of law than most new member states of the European Union. And there has been actually further deterioration in these last 5 years in all countries except Kosovo and North Macedonia, where there has been a slight improvement. If we look at the indicator on the control of corruption, here again, we unfortunately see that in the Western Balkans, the control of corruption is weaker than in most EU new member states. And there has been a decline in the rank of these countries in most cases, except for Kosovo and Montenegro. This is another indicator. It's the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, which shows that, in fact, also in this sense, the Western Balkans are unfortunately high up in the upper part of the ranking of 180 countries, indicating that, in fact, corruption is in a bad state. And even if we compare the Western Balkans with some of the new member states that have been accused of or blamed for corruption and so on, if we compare it with Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, we see that the Western Balkans are in a far worse situation. In addition to all these political problems and other things that we can discuss later, I want to stress the persistence of many economic problems, which actually came to the surface with the global economic crisis. Imbalances on the external accounts, high trade and current account deficits due to low competitiveness of these countries on foreign markets. And somehow we see that the Western Balkans are still far less integrated in the global economy with respect to the new member states from Central and Eastern Europe. There are also huge problems on the labor markets, where we have high unemployment, low employment rates, widespread shadow economy. There's been a rise in poverty and inequality, continuous brain drain of young people, of the best experts. And this is something that is certainly alarming. And these economies have gone through fast structural changes, strong deindustrialization with very fast expansion of services, and perhaps wrong policies regarding foreign direct investment, unselective attitude towards foreign investors. And it all comes down to actually still a low level of economic development. I'll just show you one graph, which shows how the Western Balkans are still at only 31 to 46% of the EU average GDP per capita. And this is without Kosovo, for which we do not have data, but which is even less developed than Albania. So in all these years, there has been actually very limited catching up, very limited convergence towards EU income, average income in the EU. So coming to current challenges, precisely because there's been a very slow progress in EU Western Balkan integration in these 30 years, the European Commission has tried to invent new initiatives, new methodologies, and etc. And we see that from 2013 onwards, we see that a new approach is being implemented based on 3 pillars: economic governance, rule of law, and public administration reform, precisely because these are some of the key issues that must be handled as priority issues. I'm sorry, it goes by itself. Then there was the Berlin process, which was the idea was to launch a project. It was Angela Merkel's idea to launch this Berlin process in order to provide for better connectivity of the region through better infrastructure, energy, transport, and create a regional economic area in the Western Balkan region. And in fact, we had 6 summits, high-level summits within this Berlin process. There was one also in Trieste, one was also in Italy. And then the European Commission also launched a new enlargement strategy in 2018 with a new methodology, which should be more efficient. But also it was precisely in 2018 that the European Commission even mentioned that some countries could possibly become members of the EU in 2025. Now, this is a long forgotten story because there's been many things that have actually happened in the meantime. And the latest initiative by the European Commission is this economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans that was adopted in the midst of the pandemic in October 2020. This plan actually provides 9 billion euros for the Western Balkans over the next 7 years, while additional investment should be obtained through some 20 billion euros should be obtained through investment guarantees. And this is certainly an unprecedented package, considering the amount and the willingness to offer this package to the Western Balkans, but it may not be enough to ensure faster convergence of the Western Balkans to EU income levels, because the overall amount is still low, especially if we compare it to some of the funds that have been earmarked for some EU member states. And therefore, somehow, at least this is what is being stressed by many experts on the Western Balkans, there is a risk of further divergence in economic development of the Western Balkans with very negative political repercussions. And in fact, I want to share this map with you. It was prepared by Matteo Bonomi from the Institute of International Affairs in Rome, where you can see, where we can compare Romania with the 6 Western Balkan countries in the next 7 years, how much they should be receiving from the European Union, as they are a similar population. Romania has a population somewhat a bit larger than the 6 Western Balkan countries. And here we see that over the 21-27 period, Romania ought to receive 7 times more on a per capita basis than the Western Balkans. More than almost 3,600 euros, of course, on the basis of various structural funds, cohesion, common agricultural policy, but also Next Generation EU and so on, while the Western Balkans will be receiving only 500. So I think these figures are quite indicative. Coming to the end, today there are unfortunately rising ambiguities regarding future EU enlargements, since we actually have very different views held within the EU Council by the individual EU member states, by the European Parliament, the new Commission, the new EU Commission. And there is actually lack of clarity. What does European perspectives actually mean? And there was recently a high-level summit in Brdo, near Kranj in Slovenia in October 2021, where we see that the European perspectives of the Western Balkans were again reconfirmed, but without a firm timeline for their accession. So it's all to be defined. And we can perhaps return to these issues during the discussion. I hope I have not spoken for longer than 15 minutes that I have assigned to everyone. I will end here now, and I will immediately pass the floor to our colleague from Belgrade, who was supposed to be here but was not able to come because of the COVID restrictions. So thank you for your attention. Let me just close my presentation. And so allora la Paolina Jovan, are you with us, Professor Terkakis? Okay. It's been uploaded. Okay, so
Can you make there's as our colleague mentioned yesterday, I also hear this echo, but it's probably my problem. Never mind. Can you somehow make these individual pages on the left side of the screen disappear so that we can see the main thing, you know?
Yes.
Better?
No, mi sta, vedi, non riesco qua. Ecco, sì.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Jovan, are you able? Shall I move your slides?
Yes, please, because my Mac doesn't like the competition from Microsoft. So thank you very much for that, and also for setting the stage for many different but connected topics that we're going to follow during the next 3 hours or so. So my intention here was to show you how I see the interplay, the interaction and mutual influences between two processes. On the one side, the EU enlargement policy, and on the other, de-democratization in the Western Balkans. In the latter case, I chose one of several terms used for this phenomenon lately, in order to emphasize actually that there was, previous to this, the current de-democratization, there was democratization in the Western Balkans until roughly a decade ago. So please, let's go to the next page, please. And I don't have to go too much into this and to prove, it's well documented actually that both processes I'm focusing on are in deep crisis, or the EU enlargement, at least to the Western Balkans. And everybody would agree with me probably that this process is stuck at the moment. This is the most commonly used phrase. As far as de-democratization is concerned, it's up in comparison with a decade ago. And I'll just mention several most important elements of these well-documented claims I have just mentioned. First, I'm going to show you something that you all know, how EU enlargement to the Western Balkans is very late and very inefficient. You see here, I offered statistics, EU accession periods in years for the last actually Big Bang, 2004, 7, and 13, because these accession periods are longer than the ones we had in the past waves cycles of EU enlargement. But even the most, how to say, the closest countries to the Western Balkan ones actually acted in a much more efficient way, starting from Slovenia, that managed, after some hesitation at the beginning, to finish the accession in 8 years, and ending with Malta and Cyprus, that are a different story actually, that applied for membership much earlier than other ex-communist countries. This is why their path towards the Brussels gate was longer. Let's go to the next page, please. And here's how inefficient the current enlargement of the Western Balkans is. So if you remember these much smaller figures from the previous page, you see now that, for example, Montenegro, that is the most successful or the least unsuccessful country in current EU accession, It applied for EU membership 13 years ago. It began accession negotiations 9 years ago and opened all chapters, but closed only 3, and those 3 only provisionally. As you know, as far as Serbia is concerned, 12 years since application, 9 years since becoming a candidate, and 7 years since the beginning of accession negotiations with the EU. It opened only 18 chapters, so just a few more than a half, and provisionally closed only 2. The pace of Serbia's accession that I'm offering you the info on is very troublesome. As you see, during the last several years, we went through, well, almost good year 2017, during which 6 chapters were opened. Then in the next year, that was reduced to 4, in 2019 to 2, and now during the last 2 years, not a single chapter was opened. So that is really catastrophic, and I would say a deserved results as far as Serbia's record is concerned. Albania is expecting to begin accession negotiations 12 years after the application, and Macedonia, as Milica mentioned 2 minutes earlier, it got actually candidate status 16 years ago. This is almost equally bad as Turkish record. Bosnia and Kosovo even further from all kinds of dates, etc., etc. Let's go to the next page, please. Thank you, Milica. So I'm not going into something that Milica has also shown. This is the trust in the EU and the popularity of the EU. One of the reasons being the results of various public opinion polls vary quite substantially now. But there are some things actually that trends are the same. So you have the most, how to say, optimistic nations, Albanians in the Western Balkans, that opt very strongly for the EU, and something like 80 or even more than 90% of them, especially in Kosovo, not only in Albania, trust the EU and would like their countries to get into the EU. Unfortunately, as far as Kosovo, but also as far as Albania is concerned, these are the countries and the nations which are, very, very far from any kind of fast access. On the other hand, you have the most Eurosceptic country, which is Serbia, and now it's been joined lately by Macedonia. And you see here that although EU membership is still popular, in varying degrees, I repeat, pessimism prevails regarding fast accession, and that has to be taken very seriously. According to one public opinion poll just published, actually, almost every 4th West Balkan citizen now thinks accession will never happen. And we were surprised last year when the same people in their opinion poll from 2020, from a year ago, found out actually that every 5th, in average, Western Balkan citizen claimed the same, that their country will never get into the EU. And when we turn to the most or more Eurosceptic countries like Serbia and North Macedonia, half of their citizens, almost half actually, think the same, or do not see their countries in the EU until at least 20 years from now, which is a horrible 2041. As far as democratization is concerned, of course, for several years now, there has been, and it has been noted and debated a lot, serious backsliding in democracy and the rule of law throughout the region, with the term captured states actually used several times now in European Commission yearly reports. According to Freedom House and other similar estimations, all Western Balkan countries are not democracies anymore. They are partly free, as Freedom House says, and having transitional governments or hybrid regimes. Let's go to the next page, please. So this is a well-known presentation of how several, in this case, 4 ex-communist countries, 2 from Central Europe, Poland and Hungary, and 2 from the Western Balkans, are sliding down actually in terms of democracy during the last decade or so, since 2010. You see Poland went down 1 category from the category of consolidated democracies to semi-consolidated democracies during these 10 or 11 years, and Hungary was even more successful in the downward trend it has had. So it went during the same time to the category of transitional and hybrid regimes, and joined Serbia and Montenegro. That went from semi-consolidated democracies to this category of transitional hybrid regime. Let's go to the last slide with this data, and I almost wasted 9 minutes. So what is also interesting to see here is that the initial progress actually in democratic performance, which was not negligible actually, starting from 2004 and going up until 2010, this progress was annulled already half a decade ago. So in 2016, Western Balkan countries in average were at the same level of democracy or non-democracy as they were 12 years before in 2004. Let's go to the next slide. And here's, so Serbia is one of top 10 autocratizing countries, and it is being actually very much different actually from other Western Balkan countries in this respect, but not too much. Let's go to the next one. So now let me just list what are the context and the policies of the EU on the one side and the Western Balkan on the other side that contributed actually to this interplay and mutual influences and strengthening of, on the one side, EU enlargement process, and on the other side, de-democratization. The European Union, of course, as we all know, has been going through multiple crises since 2005. And what was different since that time in comparison with previous decades and years, it has adopted in many, not in most, especially in older EU member states, politicians have adopted this inward looking, and they were dominated by demands, how they understood them, of internal politics. We saw clearly in this, the latest decade and a half of the EU, functioning of the EU, the lack of strategic thinking and leadership. And enlargement very obviously ceased to be EU priority after the Big Bang 2004 and 2007. In addition, what was, I think, what had a very bad effect for the Western Balkans, it has been marginalized in all kinds and senses, despite optimistic political declarations. During the accession negotiations, the dominant type of behavior on the EU side was technocratic monitoring and lack of political steer. We had what was a very interesting and popular term a few years ago, the so-called stabilitocracy, the EU traded democracy with Western Balkans autocratic leaders for short-term stability, and used lack of reforms in the Western Balkans as an additional excuse for lack of intervention. 5-6 years ago, with the coming of big influxes of refugees, and with the invigoration, with the strengthening of the new Cold War, if I can say, geopolitical competition between the West and Russia, things got different. And from that time on, actually, which is not good for Western Balkans, we have been seen from Brussels and from other main capitals from a geopolitical perspective. I'm afraid many politicians and many citizens of the European Union expect from the Western Balkans to contribute to the protection of the EU external borders in exchange for nothing, or in exchange for some pocket money. Then, very strangely, actually, accession criteria got stricter for a less prepared region in comparison with Central East Europe. There were changes of accession methodology. One important was introduced in February 2020. But as we have seen in the case of other democratic backsliding in the existing EU member states like Hungary and Poland, the EU has still not found actually adequate instruments to deal with this phenomenon, with this problem. And also it seems now that actually that it hasn't used the conditionality policy well for the same purposes in the Western Balkans. Finally, the EU opted for differentiated accession lately. In other, how to say, emulations of this thesis, it is becoming very popular to speak of the so-called phased accession, during which, in an unpredictable number of years and decades ahead of us, Western Balkans will get more of the membership and more of the money actually that goes with the membership. If I can use just 2 minutes more, Milica, and I apologize, let us go to the last. I have more slides, etc. The last, the next slide. So what did the Western Balkans government do? They, of course, inherited a very complicated post-conflict context, and the high conflict potential that we hoped would disappear after so many years, it has remained to be actually very high. Gatekeepers of the EU accession, our governments in the Western Balkans, have been very successful in manipulating with ethnic and other conflicts in the region, both internally and externally in the regional context, whenever actually they needed a break from reforms or a boost for the next elections. As Stefano will be saying, I suppose later, we have never-ending reconciliation. It's been very complicated to cope with the so-called Copenhagen Plus or EU Acquis Plus that is reserved for good reasons for us in this region. And that means that in addition to complicated and ever-growing number of hundreds of thousands of pages, we need actually what was included in our homework was actually very complicated and identity-related things like war crimes, state building, status and name issues, etc., etc., etc. The last thing I will mention is that some, if not all, Western Balkan states have turned in this situation to EU competitors from the East, Russia, China, Turkey, as EU membership has become a moving target and maybe actually a target impossible to reach when we think of Macron's ideas and actions 2 years ago and Bulgaria's never-ending efforts to prevent North Macedonia to begin accession negotiations. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Jovan. I hope you can stay with us this morning because we're going to along to hear the other speakers and then we'll have a final discussion at the end. All right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now we can immediately move on to the next speaker. Just let me close your presentation. We have Jelena Jankic. Jelena Jankic, who will be joining us from Florence. Now, participants, I have to give you, okay, here. Imposter comment, it's okay, all right. Va bene, full screen, no?
Okay. Can you hear me, Milica?
Yes, Jelena, we hear you very well. So
Okay.
the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Milica. It's a pleasure to join this event. I would have loved to have been in Perugia today, and you know that was my intention, but unfortunately I was unable to join in person due to health reasons. Well, the beauties of this switch to the digital space mean that I am actually able to be there with you and to participate in this very stimulating discussion. I'd like to thank once again Professor Ulic for convening this panel and obviously for inviting me to take part in it. For those of you who have never met me, my name is Jelena Jankic, and I'm part-time professor at the Global Governance Program of the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute in Florence, where I co-direct the Global Citizenship Observatory, so the Global Cit Observatory, and I also do quite a lot of work on the Western Balkans. One of those outputs, and I will do some shameless self-promotion here, has to do actually with the topic of today's panel, and it's the edited volume with Søren Kyle and Marko Kmesic on the Europeanization of the Western Balkans, a failure of EU conditionality, where the most renowned scholars of the region, including Professor Uvelic, have contributed. So without further ado, and I have digressed a little bit, I will speak about the state capture in the Western Balkans. I will try to briefly explore how it has been used as a sort of a structural mechanism for reproducing political power of the, above all, ruling elites, but also in some cases of ethnic elites. And essentially, my main claim is not reinventing the wheel or inventing any hot water, and it's something that has been raised as an issue this morning, and that is that a protracted political transition coupled with obviously political instability, domestic and external state contestation cause conditions that are favorable to the decline of good governance and to obviously the capturing of states across the Western Balkan region. Now, if you think about it, it in a way is a self-reinforcing mechanism, because then state capture is used to reproduce the power of those who actually had captured the state's institutions. And what I will speak a little bit about this morning are two dominant mechanisms through which this is done. One is the state capture in the domain of public administration. And we'll see in a minute why public administrations are important and how essentially having party cadre or ethnic preferentialism in the domain of public administration can essentially perpetuate political power of the ruling elites. Secondly, I will speak about how privatization process and irregularities that have emerged during those processes across the whole of the Western Balkans essentially reinforced the power base of political elites, allowing them to thus finance their political campaigns and political projects. Now, you probably, most of you who are in that room, you are aware of the elites theories and the literature that has emerged in the post-communist period, and especially that related to Eastern Europe, has emphasized how political and economic elites never willingly renounce their power that they have acquired in the old system. Now, therefore, once this in a way, power of the old socialist system has eroded with the fall of communism, and especially in the context of the former Yugoslavia, where countries were faced with breakup, economic recession, all sorts of societal, political, and economic decline. These elites that had preferential positions in the old system essentially adapted their rhetoric and adjusted their ideological positions. Now, this fact, in combination with their proximity to power in the old system, has enabled them to capture, one, the structural resources of the former communist states, and B, quite a lot of the cultural capital that these societies have had. And that capital, if you think about it, back in the 90s, has not been articulated. It was only in a cradle, if you wish. So they could feed it with these structural resources. And when I say structural resources, think about the 90s, societies that are starting to go through a process of transition. These resources included pretty much everything from buildings of former companies to buildings of states institutions to all sorts of infrastructures that states possess. So this was something that was captured immediately. Now, this, in a way, elites' grip on these structural and cultural resources, when combined with this rhetoric on what a culture, what an ethnicity should be, gave rise or gave prominence to ethnic elites alongside the region or across the entire region. And these elites were subsequently able to represent themselves as the so-called, if you wish, fathers of the nation. So this is one of the elements that has been crucial for reproducing then their political power. Once they captured the structural resources of the state, they were able to install their party cadre or ethnically affiliated cadre in the national bureaucracies, meaning you wouldn't become a permanent employee or a public servant unless you had a party card. So just to translate it in very palpable terms. What does this mean then? It means that as a part of the ruling elite, I can count on you to be my voter. And not only on you, but also on your extended family, because why? If they vote for someone else, you're going to lose your job. So in a way, this has enabled these political elites to simply perpetuate their political power. The second one is the capture of economic resources during the process of privatization. And this has established, in a way, a new economic elite, which was strongly tied to the political establishment. Now, these links between the political establishment and the economic elite have facilitated further extraction of resources and in a way just reinforced the state capture. So I know that it kind of sounds repetitive, but state capture is a sort of a vicious circle. Elites capture the state, which then helps them to stay in power or to stay dominant in a societal context by reproducing them. Now, quickly, to give you two very pragmatic examples, I've mentioned and also previous, I apologize, speakers have mentioned how public administration reform has been one of the strategic priorities, and it is one of the requirements for EU accession. Yet, all the reports of the European Commission highlight how bureaucracies, how public administration in the Western Balkans is slow and inefficient. In many cases, and especially in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in Montenegro, which has the highest, I think, per capita civil servants across the region, bureaucracies have been deemed as slow and inefficient. And if you think about the impact of state capture on this, it's precisely the thing that I have explained a little while ago. Public administration is populated with party cadres, and that essentially means with voters. So essentially what happens then is that costs of reform are too high for political actors, as they would in a way entail a loss of voters by reforming public administrations to make them more efficient and in line with European requirements. Now, obviously, this would need a backup plan and quite a lot of political engagement in democracy as an issue to be resolved. And as a result of the fact that these political elites prefer to have captured states and stay in power instead of democratizing, we have not only the capture of the state, but also the corruption of democracy. And I'll just go to the second example, which is privatization and the issue of economic resources. As we have heard, the process of privatization, meaning when you have states' assets that go into private hands, it is a major source of power, not only economic power, but also a source of political power. And this is something that has also happened across whole of Eastern Europe. And I think both the Western Balkan and East European experience before it have shown how these processes have been accompanied with nepotism, cronyism, corruption, and just to name a few of the things that have been happening. And in those processes, preference and manifest preference has been given to political elites in the countries such as Serbia in terms of privatization, quite a lot of agricultural establishments, water industry, etc. In Montenegro in terms of privatization of hotel industries, aluminum plant, etc. And in the case of Macedonia, with the privatization, for instance, of the Macedonian National Tobacco Company, which was a sort of a successful enterprise in the context of North Macedonian economic context. Or equally, preference has been given to ethnic elites, as had happened in the case of privatization in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where essentially this issue of ethnic compatriotism has come into play when giving access to particular individuals in terms of the ability to obtain access to privatizing companies. Now, as a result, these new economic actors who got these companies close to government started to support political projects of those who enabled them to get access to those economic resources. Now, I think I could speak about this for ages, but I think it's perhaps time to conclude and leave the rest for the discussion. So I'm just going to say a final sentence, and that's the fact that the symbiosis of structural, cultural, and economic state capture perpetuates inherently corrupt and unhealthy systems, which are, as we have seen in Professor Teokarevich's presentation, very prone to sliding back into authoritarianism and very prone into democratizing. And this, I think, will be one of the key challenges in the EU integration course of the Western Balkans. Thank you very much, and I apologize if I've gone over time.
Thank you very much, Jelena, for your excellent presentation and explanation of this of the notion of state capture from various points of view. I hope you can stay with us for the final discussion.
Yes, I'm planning to stay this morning.
Okay. So I suggest we move immediately to the next speaker, which is Will Bartlett. So Professor Will Bartlett from the London School of Economics. We'll be talking about the link between financial systems to the West Balkans and corruption, I believe. Will, the floor is yours. Try to keep it into, to 15 minutes if possible.
Okay, can I can I share my screen?
Of course.
Do you have to give me permission because I can't
I don't
see how to do that.
You just have to go into, there is an arrow right next.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes, but he needs to be authorized by you.
Uh-huh. Does he? Paul, I think you hmm?
To upload the
To upload his. Can you try and do it? I'm told you don't have to be authorized.
No, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
I've sent it to you on your email. I don't know if you can upload it at your end via email.
It would be easier. Huh? Sì, è un po' complicato andare nella mia mente. Will, I suggest I'll get your presentations from my email, but
Okay.
let's make a short coffee break now. So I'll do that during the coffee break and we'll meet in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. We'll make the coffee break now, and in the meantime, I'll get your presentation from my email. Okay?
Okay.
So I'll see you in 10 minutes.
No, no, not on table. No.
So welcome back. And now we have Will Bartlett from the London School of Economics, who will be telling us about international assistance and the control of corruption in the Western Balkans. So Will, I got your presentation. The floor is yours, and just tell me when to move on.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Very nice to be with you all today. and wish I could be with you in person, but obviously not possible. But anyway, let's move on to the next slide. Let's we go to the next slide straight away.
Not moving.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Well, you can just yeah. Okay. Click one at a time at the points that come up. First point. That's it. Yes. It's about the extensive international assistance which has been given to the Western Balkans over the last 3 decades, with a total of about 65 billion of so-called official development assistance, which is all the aid which has been given on either through as grants or loans with a grant element. And so this is you know, a significant investment in the region. And we heard earlier that it's not as big as or at least the EU element of this is not as big as the cohesion funds going to neighbouring countries in the EU. But on the other hand, it is supplemented by more billions from the international financial institutions, World Bank and IMF and so on. So it's not insignificant. About half of this aid has come from the EU as pre-accession assistance. Next point. Sorry, it goes point by point through each slide, yeah. And the European Commission reckons in its annual reports that the Western Balkans don't yet have functioning market economies, which is a bit of a euphemism, I think, for high unemployment, and they're worried that there might be a mass migration if there's once these countries join the EU, like happened in Croatia, in after 2013 when Croatia joined. But they also point to the weakness of governance in the terms of state capture, which we've heard a lot about today, clientelism, weak rule of law, and widespread corruption that are the hallmarks of the region's political economy. Next point. Okay, so this paper, which is actually it's a paper that was published last year in the Journal of Contemporary European Studies, and this presentation builds on that. And it asks whether international assistance, all this international assistance which has been given, has worsened the extent of corruption or reduced it. Because it is rather remarkable that that after 3 decades of a massive infusion of international aid and EU assistance, that these economies are still not regarded as functioning market economies, and they're still seem to be increasingly subject to these defects, the state capture, corruption, and so on. Okay, so next. Okay, the next. Click. Okay, so as I've said, the official development assistance is provided on concessional terms, mostly grants, and the donors who adhere to the principles of this set out by the OECD for international development assistance are members of the Development Assistance Committee, DAC, and they are the DAC, so-called DAC donors. So next. Okay, so you can find 4 different groups of donors of ODA to the Western Balkans. First of all, and most importantly, there are the EU institutions, which consist of the European Commission and the European Investment Bank. And then the EU bilateral donors who are DAC members. So it's EU countries such as Germany, Austria, Italy, and so on. And then there's the non-EU bilateral donors who are also DAC members. So these are countries such as USA, Switzerland, Norway, and so on. And then you've got to this 4th group, which have appeared more recently, the non-EU bilateral donors who are not DAC members. And these are the so-called new actors which have entered into the region, such as Russia, China, Turkey, and so on. So, and as I said, this is all supplemented by this other official finance provided by the World Bank and the IMF. So next. Okay, so this gives a picture of what's happened over the last 30 years. And you can see that you can sort of possibly classify it into three main periods, and then the current day. So in the first period, up to the Kosovo War, the international assistance was started off quite low and then gradually built up. But it wasn't until 1999 and the Kosovo War that the international assistance really took off. And this followed, this is the EU. You can see the total international assistance in the black, thick black line, and the EU assistance in the dotted line. And you see the EU assistance taking off after the Kosovo War, when the EU became much more involved. I mean, previously they'd been much more focused on Central and Eastern Europe, but they then, after the war, they turned their attention more to the Western Balkans, and the stabilization and association agreements were adopted. And then you had the Thessaloniki Declaration, which Milica referred to earlier, in 2003, announcing that these countries were prospective members of the EU. And then you had the first EPA program developed in 2007. And then you had the obviously the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, which hit the region. And so you had the second phase of international aid, 2010 to 2020. And you had this phenomenon of post-crisis enlargement fatigue. Aid dropped off. Tougher rule of law conditionality in the EPA 2 program 2014, which made it much more difficult, raised the bar for the countries to join the EU, made it all much more difficult and slowed the whole thing down. And partly as a result of that, the entry of the new actors in mid 2010s. And what you can see from the diagram is that in this latter period, the EU has actually, although there's been this sort of enlargement fatigue and so on, the share of EU assistance in total has become quite high. So if you go to the next slide, you see that more clearly. Okay, so this is just breaking down those totals by these four different groups. And you can see these three peaks. In the first, well, in this, where the second period I just referred to after the Kosovo War, the bilateral DAC donors became the sort of dominant donors to the region. But after the economic crisis, their donations fell off because presumably they felt they couldn't really afford it anymore. But the EU stepped in, and the EU became the chief donor to the region. And as I said, this is despite the so-called enlargement fatigue. In practice, the actual donations were increased and became very large. And then in this second half of the last decade, the new actors, you can see that new bilateral non-DACs boosted quite a lot. So that's the overall picture. So next slide. And you can see this just in terms of these three periods. The total is on the final column, and this is the proportions for each period by different donor groups. You can see that in the first two periods, the DAC EU donors were the most important ones, with 38% each period. And in this latter period, last decade, the EU became more prominent with 45% of the total donors. But you can also see that the non-DAC, non-EU donors, I've highlighted the wrong number there, but the non-DAC, I have highlighted the right number. The non-DAC donors, it's the new actors, contributed 12.5% in this last decade, which is a big increase over what they had been contributing previously. Okay, so next slide. And this gives a picture of the sort of effect of in the sort of size of the donations in terms of in per capita terms. You can see that Kosovo has been major beneficiary in per capita terms of $280 ODA over the last decade. And North Macedonia has been the country which has received the least in terms of ODA. And I mean, these numbers are not huge if we compare them to the numbers shown in the previous slides, previous presentation for, I think Militz's presentation for the cohesion funds going into Bulgaria, Romania, and so on. But you must remember that these are supplemented by the other official finance and other sort of flows. So anyway, as far as ODA is concerned, Kosovo has been major beneficiary. That's been decreasing in recent years. And North Macedonia has been rather an aid orphan, as it might be called, in relation to other countries. And you can see the different contributions of the different donor groups, but I won't go into that due to lack of time. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, the distribution of aid. In distributing the aid, the EU donors are supposed to abide by what are called the principles of the EU Code of Conduct on International Aid, which was established in 2017, which is an agreement between all the EU countries and the EU institutions, how they were going to conduct themselves in the provision of aid. And what came out of that was the great importance of donor coordination and the potential negative effects of donor proliferation. So the EU countries are supposed to coordinate amongst each other and with the EU institutions. So next slide, but the next point rather, the proliferation of donors has allowed countries to cherry pick among them in the form of international regulatory arbitrage. So it means that if there's very many donors, then there's a sort of competition effect, sort of negative competition effect from the donor's point of view, that the recipients can choose more or less which donors they want to take on board, and they can choose between them. So they're going to choose those donors which have the least conditionality attached to their grants. So this is partly why they have been turning recently to the new actors who have much less conditionality compared to this very strict EU conditionality, especially with regard to the rule of law, the rent seeking and corruption and so on. So it's much more beneficial in a sense for countries to take $1 million from China than it is for them to take $1 million from the EU with all the conditions attached. And this sort of the countries have become sort of very adept at playing donors off against each other. So you can see that in the recent incidents in Montenegro with the motorway, where they borrowed $1 billion or whatever from China, and then found they couldn't pay it, and then they turned to the EU, and the EU agreed to pay it, so, or roll over the loan at any rate, despite the fact that Montenegro is not sort of fulfilling the conditionalities for the loan because they're frightened that Montenegro will fall into the hands of the Chinese. So on the other hand, some of the recipients have been favoured by the donors more than others. We'll see in a moment. So there's the donors' interest involved as well, and you can ask whether the donors are altruistic or are they self-interested. And there's quite a big literature on whether aid allocations follow international trade flows or investment flows, or whether they are motivated by a desire to reduce migration pressures and all this sort of thing, or are they really sort of altruistic in terms of giving money to the poorer countries? So this is what's known, and also the so-called Samaritan's dilemma. Does that apply to the donor assistance in the region? So it means that if the countries don't fulfill the conditionalities, should the EU or other donors withdraw their assistance? And this is what's proposed in the EPA 2 and the EPA 3, that there should be some sort of punishment for countries which don't reform fast enough or reform in the right way, or it's rather more put in the way of a reward for countries which do reform in the right way. So the idea is that in the EPA program, the aid will be reallocated as time goes forward to countries which are better reformers than others. But in practice, this actually doesn't happen because the EU doesn't really want to withdraw aid from Serbia because it's got a poor rule of law record. because it wants to encourage Serbia to improve its rule of law. So there's a very much a sort of two-way effect here, and there's potential vicious circles or virtuous circles that might apply to these things. So next slide. Okay, well, this shows the distribution of aid across each recipient. So you're looking at if you look at the first column, Albania, you can see the numbers there refer to the proportion of aid allocated by each donor to Albania. So 36% of Albania's aid comes from the EU institutions. But you can also see that, and that's the majority of aid for every country does come from the EU institutions. But considering the bilateral donors, you can see in Albania, Germany is the main donor to Albania, has the largest share of Albania's receipts of aid come from Germany. Bosnia-Herzegovina is United States, Kosovo, United States, Montenegro, Germany, North Macedonia, United States. So United States and Germany are sort of two of the biggest donors, which have are more or less relevant to different countries. And then in Serbia, it's the non-DAC bilateral donors, the new actors, which have become tremendously important in Serbia, along with the multilateral agencies. So next slide. This shows the same information, but sort of divided up horizontally. So Albania receives 9.7% of the EU institutions' total allocations of aid, for example. Bosnia-Herzegovina gets 17%, 17.5%. So looking donor by donor, looking at the horizontal rows, you can see that Germany allocates most of its aid to Serbia, or the largest proportion, the largest recipient, if you like, is Serbia. 37.9% of German aid goes to Serbia. But then Sweden and Austria have the largest share allocation to Bosnia and Herzegovina, meaning that Bosnia and Herzegovina is a sort of favorite of Sweden and Austria. And you can think of this, particularly in terms of Austria, as a sort of perhaps historical ties, colonial ties, that sort of thing might be influencing it there. Greece and Italy provide most of their aid to Albania. Same sort of thing, Italy, colonial ties perhaps, Greece, border issue, neighboring country, a lot of immigrants from Albania into Greece, and so the specific factors. And then going down to the non-EU bilateral donors, you see United States, Norway and Switzerland favour Kosovo, Japan favours Bosnia, and then the non-DAC countries, the new actors, favour Serbia very much. So there's this very strong link between the new actors in Serbia, which comes out of this. And then you can see that Montenegro and North Macedonia are not the favourites of any donors. They're the sort of aid orphans, if you like, especially worrying for North Macedonia. Montenegro is a bit more advanced, so perhaps doesn't matter so much, but North Macedonia is pretty much left out of this picture. Anyway, next. Okay, so turning to corruption, there's a large literature between aid and corruption, and the literature much of the literature argues that aid may actually facilitate rent seeking by governments. This is because the aid that is received sort of substitutes for the public services that governments would have to provide by themselves, and then governments can then use that resources to fund clientelistic payments, as was described by Jelena, to provide jobs to their cronies and all this sort of thing, or they can siphon off money from the public purse through dodgy contracts with companies owned by their friends and all this sort of thing. So it's not that aid is directly being channeled into corrupt activities. It's more that aid is substituting for other public monies that are then used for rent seeking. And at high level, other NAC, for example, 2001 argues that high levels of aid may even erode the quality of governance. We've seen that in the Kosovo case, they've had very high levels of aid, and it may be, well, that these high levels of aid have actually damaged rather than improved the quality of governance, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So next, So the debate continues more recently over whether international aid worsens corruption, clientelism, rent-seeking, and state capture. And so you can see different proponents of both sides of the argument. Proponents of worsening to important articles by Lesina and Weda and Jankov, and a specific article on EU aid in Czech Republic recently argued or supported the proposal that EU aid increased corruption risk by 34% in the Czech Republic. That's a sort of very specific one, looking at EU aid to Eastern Europe, and not much. Most of the studies have been done in developing countries. And then there are proponents of neutral effect. In fact, there are two articles there, and there's not many proponents of positive effects, which is a bit worrying. Anyway, that's the debate. I mean, it's a huge literature. I just highlighted a couple there. So next, so as I said, there's possibly a vicious circle in which countries with greater corruption attract more aid, and which in turn reduces the quality of governance and raises the degree of corruption. So this is very worrying, because it means that there may be a downward spiral, that aid is actually making the situation worse. And this sort of reflects the vicious circle that Jelena was talking about in respect of the state capture. The state capture gives resources to the elites, who are then able to capture the state even more, and it's sort of downward spiral. And it may be that the international aid organizations are involved in this downward spiral. I mean, I'm not saying they are. I'm just saying this is possible, a possible effect which needs to be taken into consideration. So, next slide. Okay, so looking at the data, we've got data from the OECD. Collects data on all international aid given through the DA Stat Committee and other donors. And here on the vertical axis, you can see the control of corruption. Better control of corruption is higher up the scale, worse control of corruption down the scale. And then on the horizontal axis, you've got the official development assistance as a proportion of gross national income. So that's the relative importance of official development assistance. And you see that the higher that is, the worse is the control of corruption. So, and it's a significant negative correlation, Pearson correlation coefficient of 0.5 minus 0.5, significant at 1%. So what it seems to imply is this very worrying feature that the more ODA a country gets in the Western Balkans, the worse their control of corruption is. So let's move to the next slide. Next point. Okay, so this negative relationship, it holds up whichever way you look at it. You can look at gross national income per capita. You can break it down by the EU institutions or the non-EU donors, the new actors. I mean, the only thing I'd say is that for the EU institutions, the relationship the correlation is a little bit weaker and it's a little bit less important. So it's only minus 0.3, whereas for the non-EU donors, it's almost minus 0.6. So these data suggest that rather than supporting the adoption of EU norms in the region, ODA flows may contribute to the ability of ruling elites to sidestep such norms and the EU accession conditionalities relating to them. Okay. So I then finally, I estimate an aid allocation model using this data from the DAC committee, and it's a panel data regression over the period 2009-2018 for all the Western Balkan countries and donor groupings. So next point. It's the dependent variable is the ODA over the gross national income. So it's the allocation. It's a model explaining how countries allocate their ODA to the different Western Balkan countries. And this follows the approach adopted by Lesina and Weber in the article I referred to earlier. And the independent variable. So the question is, what's the influences that affect the distribution of the allocation of overseas development assistance? It's GDP per capita, and for example, of the recipient country. So you expect poorer countries to get more aid, as that has a negative coefficient expected. And then the openness to international trade. Well, if countries are actually donors are pursuing their self-interest and they're going for following the trade flows rather than altruism, then that is expected to have a positive coefficient. And specifically for the EU, if the EU is exporting a lot of goods to one particular country, then the ODA might follow those exports. So again, that has a positive expected coefficient. Candidate status could be positive or negative. And then the main point is the control of corruption. This is the World Government indicators. It's interacted with country dummy variables, and this can be positive or negative, as I've discussed throughout. You know, there might be a negative influence of control of corruption on ODA, or it might be a positive influence. So let's go next. Okay, so this is the results of the model. Each column shows the different donor groups, and I've got the multilateral organizations also there as an extra group. And what we find is that for almost looking at the GDP per capita for the DAC EU bilateral donors and the non-EU bilateral donors, the aid is allocated according to the sort of poverty of the country. So there's a negative coefficient there, meaning that the lower is their GDP per capita, the more aid they get. The non-DAC bilateral donors, there's no effect. They're not concerned about poverty or whether the countries are more or less prosperous. The EU institutions is a perverse positive sign here, which is probably because this includes European Investment Bank aid, and the European Investment Bank loans are going to go where there is more opportunity for loans, which means the richer countries. So that's what's going on there, I think. And then the multilateral organizations, the regional development banks, are also chasing poverty. And then in the next row, the openness, seems that openness is a significant factor for both the DAC EU bilateral donors and the non-DAC, the new actors, i.e. they're following the trade flows. But there's no particular, if you look at the EU import share, there's nothing there. It's not EU. It's not Germany's trade to Serbia. It's more a general openness, a willingness to trade that seems to be important. EU candidacy is not important except for the multilateral organizations who give less aid to the candidates than the non-candidates. And then coming down to the important part of the, sorry, go back a minute, please. The next 6 rows show the different countries, and this is the interesting and important part, I think, here, that let's look at Albania times control of corruption. So this means for Albania, what's the effect of control of corruption? The negative effect between the control of corruption, the greater control of corruption, you reduce the amount of aid for the non-DAC bilateral donors, whereas for the DAC bilateral donors for Albania, they reward control of corruption, so it's positive coefficient plus 1.338. That means that Albania is rewarded by the DAC EU bilateral donors if they control their corruption, whereas the non-DAC bilateral donors prefer more corrupt countries. They like to go to more corrupt countries. And then you can see for Bosnia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia, those highlighted, the significant coefficient, the ones where this effect is significant. And you see for Bosnia, for all the bilateral donors, doesn't matter whether they're EU or DAC or whatever, they're not rewarding control of corruption. They're following the corruption. And so it seems in Bosnia, corruption is out of control, really. And you've got this vicious circle where donors are actually allocating their aid to the greater the degree of corruption. And for Kosovo, a similar picture, especially for the DAC non-EUs, and for the EU institutions, strangely enough. And then for Serbia, you've got the negative coefficient for the new actors. The new actors are attracted to Serbia when it's got a higher degree of, a less degree of control over corruption. But this is offset to some extent by the EU institutions. You can see the coefficient for Serbia is minus 2.5 for the new actors, but it's plus 2.5 for the EU institutions. So the EU institutions are doing as much, sort of working hard to try to offset the influence of the new actors, the non-DACs. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Conclusion. Okay, point. The regression results broadly support the view that countries that control corruption get less aid, and the more corrupt receive more aid. This implies that international assistance facilitates rent-seeking, corruption and state capture by political elites in at least some countries of the Western Balkans, although there are, as we've seen, some exceptions to this general trend. The model broadly supports the view that the new actors are attracted to more corrupt countries in the Western Balkans. However, all donors are implicated to some degree in some countries. And then it's next, as an aside, just looking at that poverty variable, the GDP per capita, the model shows a 1% higher GDP per capita implies a 0.5% lower flow of official development assistance. So, I mean, that's not really terribly important, but just in case you're interested in that, I mean, the main point is about the corruption effects. So let's go to the next slide. I've got three conclusions. This is the second conclusion. This looks at the conclusions concerning the impact of international assistance on the role of corruption by each recipient. So Bosnia and Kosovo, corruption effect on aid allocation is pervasive, and it's for Bosnia it's negative for all the bilateral donors, and for Kosovo it's negative for both the new actors and the EU institutions. Next point. So Bosnia and Kosovo are the most problematic. Corruption is, there's some effects of corruption on the aid, sort of negative effects in Albania and Serbia. The corruption effect on aid allocation, a sort of undesirable effect, is offset by the efforts of good donors, as we've seen. So Albania, the negative effect for new actors is offset by the positive effect for the DAC EU bilateral donors, which are mainly Italy and Greece. And in Serbia, as I've already said, the negative effect for new actors is offset by the positive effect of the EU institutions. So, and then turning to Montenegro and North Macedonia, there's no evidence of any effect there, no significant effect. So in a sense, as we've seen, North Macedonia is an aid orphan, but perhaps it's been beneficial for North Macedonia to be an aid orphan, in the sense that there's at least there's no negative effects there. Okay, of aid on the corruption. So looking at it from the other point of view, this is the final slide. The effect of corruption on the international assistance by donor groups. You can see that the DAC EU, it's the Development Aid Committee donors who are EU members, have, you can see, a positive effect of their aid in Albania, but a negative effect in Bosnia on aid allocation. And this may reflect the strong influence of Italian and Greek donors in Albania. I mean, more research would be needed to be done to substantiate that. That's just a guess. The non-EU DAC countries, it's the United States and Japan and Norway and so on, have this strangely negative effect in Bosnia and Kosovo. These are the sort of two international protectorates where there's been lots and lots and lots of international aid going in by proliferation of different donors. And that may reflect the negative effects of proliferation. And then the new actors, negative effects in Albania, Bosnia, particularly Serbia, and it may conclude these donors are attracted to more corrupt countries in the region for obvious reasons. The EU institutions as a negative effect in Kosovo, but positive in Serbia. So, as I've said, it's trying to offset the influence of the new actors in Serbia. In Kosovo, corruption is sort of out of control, possibly, and it can't do much about it. And the multinational organizations are not influenced by the degree of corruption in the country, which is perhaps a sort of positive feature of their activities. Okay, so I think that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Will, for sharing with us your very interesting research. Well, something I have already read about your previous research, but this was really very updated, and it was really revealing how, in fact, very frequently financial assistance can actually stimulate more corruption. So thank you very much. I hope you can stay with us until the end.
Sure.
All right.
Yes.
So I would suggest to move on immediately to the next presentation, which will be by Luca Pieroni, my colleague from Perugia. Let me just close.
Luca, ti lascio. Puoi uscire della America, perché se no suona. Suonare a me, adesso chiuso.
Ok, l'ho chiusa.
Ecco, scusami.
It's okay. Morning. Good morning, everyone. My presentation is based on the link of corruption and firm competitiveness. This one is extended to the Western Balkan and some forecast about the effect of corruption in the last years. But before the main questions is definition of a market competition and economic freedom, and why? Because market competition, what the enlargement of European countries said that a lot of millions of citizens may buy goods and services from Western Balkans. So the second question is which type of corruption are we discussing now? Because in principle we have a different type of corruptions, and we use microdata to obtain a different type of these relationships. And the third point is the expected corruption effect of the enlargement from Balkan candidate countries or Montenegro and Serbia negotiation US sessions. So this one is the picture in which is a link at the corruptions index, less corruption index by Transparency International in 2010 and an index of economic freedom in the Western countries. What we expect is the positive relation with increased economic freedom and reduce the corruption index. This one is the main expectation also in general, but sometimes among the most corrupt nation, we have and the economic freedom does not reduce corruption, for example. Why? Because the nation respond differently to level of economic freedom, and this one depends on development conditions. So this literature invoked an institutional dimension to explain some unexpected results. In some cases, the problem depends on the dimension, on the size of this government, and a non-linear relation between regulation and freedoms. So some remarks say that probably the main point is we use an economic freedom like an aggregate indicator of effect on corruption. And the main questions to study, for example, microeconomic data to derive the dimension of economic freedom, and in particular the market. The market competition is our interest in this point, because the extension of this market in the European country may be a very important point also for firms and not only for institutions. So here we are another specific relationship. This relationship is derived by microdata in business environment and enterprise performance between 2002 to 2015. So these relationships say that if we have anti-competitive behavior, probably corruption index increase. In this case, a corruption index is in positive term, increase with this point. So if the market is very important, very important that the second measure we wanted to relate it. In particularly, what we discuss here, we discuss our perception corruption sometimes. Other times we discuss about objective corruption, for example, number of bribes, and other times we discuss about administrative and political corruption. But is in our opinion is not sufficient to disentangle the effect of corruption, because in some functions in the firms are related to a specific type of corruption. For example, using business environment and enterprise performance, what we find is there are a lot of items within this survey, and it said that, for example, firms are connected in maintaining public services, or say that some payments for business licenses and permits and so on. We have a lot of these type. We disentangle these items with respect administrative and political corruption in the burden in definition. What we obtain here is, for example, that I cannot read very well, but we have different dimensions of this item is correlated with the administrative corruption and political corruption, but is not sufficient because there are also different type of highest corruptions in some countries. In particular, in this analysis, in the statistical analysis, we extract four types of corruption, and the scale of the magnitude of corruption is very important because we can classify, for example, also some countries where corruption is not very important. And no virtual corruption is a classification for some countries, but we have some countries where, like Western Balkan, we have political corruption and is linked with the state capture. But we have in our interest, in particular for firms, the question to disentangle administrative corruption that is different. Is this administrative corruption is linked for public inspection, or is, for example, for corruption or the other things? Because firms in some countries pay for to obtain no inspection, and other countries, for example, pay to escape from taxes. This one is a very heterogeneous way to obtain some detrimental results. So this one is the classification we obtain statistically from political corruption. I can see that Bulgaria and Turkey are is ranked at high levels, but there are also probably some things about Montenegro, and some things about the rank also in Serbia. But the very interesting point is linked with administrative corruption, where, for example, in Albania, we have a lot of questions linked to corruption with the inspections. So another classifications is linked administrative corruption linked to tax, public contracts, and general regulations. In this case, we have in this case Serbia and other Western countries here are really interested on this problem. So we classify this point here and obtain the scores from these results to link the relationship between the firm competitiveness and corruption. We extract more or less a panel from 6,000 firms in all Eastern Europe, Central Asian countries, and we define the different type of corruptions separately, and we define also competitiveness of firm. Is 2-3 indicators are included. The best and used in the literature is the increase of sales over the previous years, because this one is an expectation for futures export and enlargements. So this point, this one are a graph in which we are the plot. This one is estimation in y-axis. One is neutral, so say that if you have low competitiveness, so the results are in corruption is neutral. Above this line here, for example, administration's corruption in Albania, we see there, reduce 2 times competitiveness of firms. So, and Bosnia, for example, highest administrative corruption reduce 2,000 and more 2,000 the competitiveness of firm with respect the average on the Western Balkans. So the results is not new, but say that probably corruption affect really firm competitiveness in the Western Balkans. At this point, the question is this firm competitiveness is also a problem for the new entrants, for example, for Albania, North Macedonia, or negotiation, US accessions, Montenegro and Serbia. I should that this one. I share potential new entrant with respect to late entrants and early entrants, and in this cases, I obtain an indicators on bribes in taxes by business environment and enterprises for performances. So the red point in 2005 is the post of the entrances in 2004. And the y-axis say that the dimension of the percentage of bribes in taxes here. So what I would show is that in some cases, before the access, probably in general, the countries decrease the corruptions, but after this time, after 5 years or 8 years, the corruption start increase. For example, in Slovakia, Slovenia, and Poland. So these effects of corruptions is reduced in the short term, but probably in the long term, corruption reproduced by governments and institutions and the preview aspect of corruption. So this analysis is more or less also in the late entrances, and what we check now, and the final is the finally is even for is the four candidates and Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia are the patterns linked with the expectations. So in principle, we use here the CPI pattern. In principle, this one is the score, and the score say that the Transparency International is, in this case, when increase corruption is better. At this point, Albania, for example, is a little bit better, but after 2016, more or less, but before is not very good. And like the data presented by Milica, is a Montenegro, for example, is a little bit better, and we hope in the corruption. But the other two, North Macedonia and Serbia, they predicted the value of corruption for the futures, so decrease. What we can expect for probably I can conclude that the same conclusion of the preview presenters is a Professor Tioka Urehiu, say that probably the expectations, the long-term expectation to entry in the European Union change a little in the short term, change the corruption behaviors, but after this one is discounted, and the preview analysis may forecast the same pattern also for the futures. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Luca. We're a little running out of time, but we had a long coffee break, so let us move immediately to the next speaker, Stefano Bianchini from the University of Bologna. Stefano, 15 minutes if possible.
Yes, of course. I will do my best. Good morning to everybody. The topic of my contribution is related to reconciliation and regional cooperation. There is a way out. This is the question mark. Actually, my colleagues already, Jovan and the others, mentioned the long period of the waiting period of the member states, of the candidate countries to become member states, their own hope that has been frustrated so far by the European institutions. And within this framework, I think we should raise one key issue: why the EU pattern cannot be emulated in the Balkans. I think this is a very important point because, as you know, the process of European integration is based exactly on the reconciliation starting from France and Germany. And this has been the beginning of a long process of negotiation, mediation, and inclusion. Why this process is not yet achieved in the Balkans? I think this is there are different answers to this question, different aspects. One has been in some way already mentioned by my colleagues previously, and I would say is the fragility of the democratic framework and the democratic institutions. This fragility This fragility is based on different aspects. Corruption is definitely one of the elements that can, in my view, also enjoy and be developed by the fact that there is a weak rule of law and contested constitutional courts, contested electoral laws, a low level of public administration effectiveness. But all these elements are in some way also connected to a persistent phantom in the region, and this phantom is Yugoslavia. Every time when you speak about the reconciliation as a step towards integration, means that in some way this reconciliation means that you would like to resettle, recreate Yugoslavia. This is a question that has been raised several times in Croatia, but not only. Recently also Đukanović in Montenegro raised the same issue. So this is something that is existing and psychologically is used by policymakers anytime when they want to stop a potential step towards reconciliation as a key for integration. There is also another aspect that make a big difference between the Balkans, the Western Balkans, and the origin of the EU integration process. And this is the fact that no one of the Yugoslav successor states is ready to recognize to be a defeated country as a legacy of the war. There are no doubts that Germany was ready to accept the fact that it was a defeated country. So this is what you will not find any country, despite of the fact that Croatia can speak about the fact that they won the war against Serbia. You will not find any policymakers in Serbia that will recognize such a defeat. But on the contrary, we were not in the war, and we were attacked by NATO, considering the fact that we didn't attack NATO, and so the Article 5 was not proclaimed as used because Serbia didn't threaten NATO, but NATO intervened militarily against Serbia and Montenegro. So this is just to make clear that this sort of recrimination that is still alive in the political sphere is affecting the efforts for reconciliation and regional cooperation, because the regional cooperation is connected to reconciliation, despite of the fact that there is a huge number of international organizations that are working in the Balkans in order to promote reconciliation and regional cooperation. Just to mention a few, but I can mention, as you know, NATO, the OSCE, the Central European Initiative, the Adriatic Ionian Initiative, the Adriatic Ionian macro-region, the Danubian macro-region, the Southeast European Cooperation Project, the Regional Cooperation Council, CEFTA, the Adriatic Ionian Euro-region. So imagine how many organizations with overlapping competencies are working into the region, with which result? Zero. This is the fact. All the investment, the colleagues mentioned all the investment that have been made in this direction, but what is the result? Why there is no practical effect in terms of, let's say, starting to think to the future and let the past forget or forgive, or at least considered in a different way. But even the memories, the national memories that have been created by the states are in competition in comparison with, and in despite the lot of civil society organizations that desperately try to reconstruct a memory that is closer to the historical truth. Documenta is just one of the organizations in Serbia, and there are so many organizations as well that work about even the European movement of Serbia and others that are working on these issues, but without any significant effect in the education system and in the textbooks, because the textbooks are selected by a commission appointed by the government. So there is no free market, as for instance in our country, about the textbooks, but they are selected, and so only if they respect certain rules, they can be can operate. Then, you know, within this framework, when we are speaking about cooperation and where is a way out, well, there are so many reasons of tensions in the region that make difficulties the possibility of creating conditions for cooperation. I would like just to mention few situations. First, Bosnia-Herzegovina, that has been mentioned so many times. So there is a widespread opinion in Western countries that Republika Srpska is the main obstacle to the future of modernization of Bosnia-Herzegovina and the effectiveness of the institutions. Well, to a large extent, the current crisis in Bosnia-Herzegovina has been created by a pretext that has been offered by INSCO, when he passed a law 1 week before ending his mandate about the negation of the genocide of Srebrenica, which would lead those who negate this genocide to a trial. Since this is genocide is the word that has not been used by the Serbs because they speak about the massacre, but they don't recognize the genocide. This led Dodik to take distance from that. But what is interesting is that recently, even the Croatian from Bosnia-Herzegovina took distance from this declaration of INSCO to such an extent that they voted in the parliament together with the Serbs, leaving the Bosniaks and Željko Komšić alone from this point of view. So this means that the situation is much more complicated than simply the conflict between the Federation and the Republika Srpska, because the division is going through the Federation as well. So this is something that has an impact, and this explains to you why the electoral law is so difficult to be achieved. The Constitutional Court in Bosnia-Herzegovina has been contested particularly by the Serbs, because there are 3 members that are external from the state, so they are neither Croat nor Serb nor Bosniaks, and then the role of the High Commissioner is now contested to such an extent that not only Republika Srpska, but also Russia and China do not recognize the correctness of election of the High Representative in this moment, because not all the procedures in the United Nations had been followed in order to appoint him. So this is one case. The other case is Montenegro. Montenegro is a deeply divided society in this moment, with a lot of tensions because of between majority and minority, because also the difference in terms of numbers is just 1 members of the parliament. Then there is a problem, strong problem related to the church properties, and the problem between the local Montenegrinian Orthodox Church and the Serbian Orthodox Church, which is also part of the problematic relation between the Orthodox churches and the nationhood, because similar issues you can find even between Ukraine and Russia, and in many other cases in the past between Bulgaria and Constantinople, for instance, in the other, or Bulgaria and Macedonian Orthodox churches. So even if they were gradually overcome, but they needed more or less 1 century. So this is just to explain the relevance of the problem. Then there is also charges about corruption, money laundering that has been Djukanovic, the president of the Republic, has been put under discussion. And so for Macedonia, there is also still the Bulgarian rejection to start a negotiation with North Macedonia. It seems that now the new coalition that most probably will take over the power in Bulgaria will at least soften the relationship, at least at the economic level. We'll see, however, because the contestation is related to history, textbooks, and language. So we'll see. Let me conclude, however, that there are two examples of regional cooperation that might offer opportunities in this sense. One shows that all the difficulties that member states have in this case, and this is the macro region. The Adriatic-Ionian macro region, for instance, has in this case encompasses all former Yugoslavia with the exception of Kosovo and Albania, plus Italy and Greece. And in this case, the cooperation is also extended to the networks of universities, the networks of municipalities, and the Chamber of Commerce. But the point is that the public administrations that are also involved in this contest have so huge different competencies that they found difficulties in cooperating. And so this is another key point. How can member states of this macro region allow a discussion on how to allow these local institutions to have similar competencies? I'm seeing, for instance, the Italian regions with the Giuppanie, or the cantons, or the districts in other countries, how they can cooperate in this sense. This is a technical issue, but it's a very important point. The other issues that I would like to stress a little bit is the initiative, in my view, extremely interesting for the region, that has been made by Edi Rama, Zaev, and Vucic with the Open Balkan Initiative. Why? Because in their own meetings and repeated meetings that have been, in any case, offered the opportunity to include also Kosovo. This is interesting because Vucic twice invited Kosovo to participate, but also Bosnia-Herzegovina and Montenegro, of course. And this is related to the attempt of applying the 4 liberties of the European Union into the areas so far excluded from the European integration. Particularly, this means the freedom of movement of goods, services, capitals, and people, which means strengthen the opportunities of market economy in this area, and to satisfy to a large extent the second economic criterion of the Copenhagen criteria. Because what is important to what extent these economies are able to compete with the European economy. This is one of the Copenhagen criteria. So it's something that these countries alone cannot do, cannot perform. So the fact that they would like to apply EU rules in their own territories, waiting for a long time negotiation, because they have to wait really decades, to be honest, in this all of them. It's really an important step that the European Union should support, but they don't. They don't, because they don't see this as something that has been promoted by themselves, but is promoted locally. And this is something that, for instance, has a different interpretation within the EU member states. For instance, Italy is much more prone to support the initiative rather than commissioners in the EU. But in my view, this is a possibility that, at least from the economic cooperation, can imitate or at least meet some patterns of the European Union that can emulate it, at least partially, although one of the key issues remain open as the reconciliation. But somewhere is necessary to start from. And I think this can be an opportunity that is also consistent with the Jean Monnet approach to the integration of the European Union. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you very much. Let's move immediately to the next presentation, which is by, yes, Roxana is here with us again. So
Hello.
15 minutes maximum. We're running out of time. I'm sorry, we lost some time during the coffee break. Okay.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I will try to share my screen. If it's not possible, don't worry about it, because my presentation doesn't have a lot of quantitative data, so I shouldn't, but I think you can actually see my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
You should be able to. Okay, perfect. Right, I'm going to keep it short and sweet. I thank you very much for the invitation. It's a very, very interesting panel. I very much enjoy learning from the colleagues who have presented. I'm here to talk about the challenge of anti-corruption in the EU enlargement from a Romanian perspective. So the work is based on, yes, I can see you now. Perfect, thank you. The work is based on a book that I published a couple of years ago with Paul Grave. Right, so there are a few puzzles that sort of guided my research. So, and I phrase them as research questions because we are all in the area of research here, and I think it's better to understand them like this. So the first one was, how do European Union anti-corruption policies, practices, and assumptions have framed the process of accessing European Union funding in Romania? Then a subsequent question was, what does corruption mean in this particular case? How much corruption is there in the area of European Union funding? And how efficient are the European Union funds in this context? And by efficiency, I mean to increase the development of the country and reduce corruption. So I won't talk too much about the context of Romania because you are all researchers in this area. And I know you are focusing on Western Balkans, but you are very familiar with the wider sort of area. Just a few things I would like to mention. In terms of the international context, there is a wide consensus regarding the threat of corruption in Romania and the necessities of strong anti-corruption policies in order to sort of regulate the international donors' funding lines. Three things have definitely impacted on Romania's contemporary system, societal and political system. One of them is the communist past. Secondly, a long transition, and thirdly, the necessity to join the European Union, which finally happened in January 2007. Afterwards, Romania was put on a mechanism of cooperation and verification due to the issues related to corruption. So one of the key things that's really important from this context is that, like the countries you have just described, Romania had been essentially working on crisis mode for the past 30 years. And this is essential because all the reforms that have been put in place need to be understood in this particular context. Now, when it comes to the issue of corruption, there is no magic. Romania is perceived to be as one of the most corrupt countries in the European Union, and I've put their control of corruption from the World Bank indicator, running from mid-90s to mid-2014. Bottom line, I put it in the context of Bulgaria and Greece, simply because these are countries that are part of the European Union. Bottom line, to take from this, two things. Romania is still perceived to be a very corrupt country. And secondly, all the reforms that have happened in the past 20 years are not reflected in these indicators, neither on Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, nor on the control of corruption by the World Bank. Now, let me turn to European Union accession and talk a little bit about what bottom-up European integration means in the case of Romania. And I looked at how people access European Union funding. And in doing so, I realized that there were three key actors involved, which were people who were trying to access the money, who were the applicants. Then secondly, the bureaucrats, people who are safeguarding the access to the money, to European Union funding. And thirdly, consultants who were almost negotiating between the other two key actors. Now, when trying to access this kind of money, people move between registers of eligibility, as in the applicants need to show that they are eligible to apply this kind of funding, a register of profitability because they're entrepreneurs and they need to make money, and register of compliance because after people access the money, they need to show that they are complying with the donors' regulations. Okay, so now I come to the nits and gritty of how European Union funding accessing actually works in practice in Romania. So whenever I was talking to the applicants, they said, and this is how European Union funding was presented to Romania, as free money. But really what happens in reality is that applicants realize that from free money, they really move to very expensive money. And I realized that for economists, this is a weird way to present money. But for a sociologist like myself, this makes sense. And I will present here a quote from one of my interviews. They said on TV that after 2007, there will be a river of money from the EU for rural development. Apparently, Brussels people love rural tourism. All we need to do is prepare some projects. Now I'm panicking because I did a project for a small bed and breakfast, but there is no money. So basically, the person who was panicking, saying that it's a man who had done this project, was panicking because doing a project actually means investing a lot of money. It's not cheap. It's not just some ideas jotted on a piece of paper. So basically, the people who even think about accessing this money are serial entrepreneurs, in the sense that they are very much used to accessing money, to developing small businesses and failing at these businesses. And the other thing that I want to say is that the price of compliance, like Braithwaite remarked in the mid-80s, is that government inspectors ensures the quality of your records, not the quality of your deeds. So basically, these people who are accessing money needed to make sure that on paper they looked okay. Add to this the fact that Romania is still very much a cash society that is confronted with volatile markets in which anticipative type of thinking is required and used at the maximum, and the bank loans are very expensive. So in order to counteract this very harsh crisis mode, societal and economic conditions, people rely a lot on old solidarity networks, transfer of capital, favor and gift exchange, and informal arrangements, which I have to say from the start, these are not considered corruption. These are considered exactly like I have defined them, informal arrangements. Now, let me go to the first key actor, the bureaucrats. When it comes to the bureaucrats, the institutional framework related to regulating European Union funding, fraud, and corruption is very well established in Romania. Very well established in the sense that after 2000, we have witnessed the appearance of new legal semantics, which basically means new laws, new regulations that actually frame what European Union funding fraud means. So it's not, this does not build, and corruption. So these two crimes, because they are crimes, they do not build on the previous understanding of similar crimes in Romanian legislation. This needs to be very clear. It's a completely new and modern understanding of corruption and actually fraud. We also have witnessed the specialization of the justice circuits. And by this, I mean, especially Romania was one of the first cases in which a newly set up prosecutorial body was designed to deal especially with grand corruption and European Union funding fraud. So this is like a separate prosecutorial body which had its own police dealing only with these two crimes. So that's it. And the reform of the traditional institutional establishment happened, but to a sort of a lower degree. But the specialization of the justice circuits, and by that I mean the new National Anti-Corruption Directorate, has become an elite squad, which is characterized by new emerging bureaucratic identities. Let me just show you. This institution was set up in 2000 with the European Union FARE funding by a social democratic party, and it has transformed during subsequent governments to become the elite institution that is today. Now, I put here some numbers from the peak years in which their activity kind of like skyrocketed. So in 1 year, in 2013 and 2014, they had 4,183 files, new files, over 4,000. They sent to court almost 1,000 people in that year. So it's absolute, and you can see that the numbers were only increasing subsequently. But these are cases of grand corruption. When it comes to, in similar years, when it comes to cases of fraud to the European Union, we can see that the number of cases solved is actually way smaller. So they only, in 2011, they registered 363 new cases. So if you could, it's 10 times lower, more than 10 times lower than the cases of grand corruption. So this is just to bear in mind kind of like where the money is going in terms of resources. Now, this institution, which I have called an elite squad, the National Anti-Corruption Directorate, enjoys a huge trust from the public opinion. You can see it here. It has, in 2016, which was one of their peak years, it had 60% trust from the population. If you compare this to other institutions from Romania, like, for example, the High Court of Cassation and Justice, it was less than 50%. The fiscal agency, about 40%. You can see this is quite extraordinary because this is a newly set up institution. The perception of a National Anti-Corruption Directorate abroad is extraordinary. Again, the European Commission has mentioned it in the mechanism of cooperation and verification several times, saying that it is one of the top 5 anti-corruption institutions at the EU level. And it's no surprise that the new European prosecutor, Laura Codruța-Kövesi, is the former head of the National Anti-Corruption Directorate in Romania. Now I'm moving, so this is kind of like the bureaucratic setting in which European Union funding is accessed. The second key, the second key actor that I want to refer to is consultants. These are actors that have appeared on the market because applicants do not understand the European Union language. They just don't get it. They are entrepreneurs, they are capable people, they have some money, but they do not understand what they need to do in order to access funding. And you can actually see here, I put some quotes explaining how people sort of present themselves in terms of consultants. in terms of what they need to do. But let me just say, consultants, as far as I could see, are strategic thinkers that connect work routines and policy models, and they basically managed to set up a whole new professional body in the past 10 years. They have set up training programs, education programs. They even talk about issuing hologram degrees, like degrees with a special stamp. And the imperatives of these jobs are instruction, translation, and mediation. So basically, they need to tell the applicants what they need to do. They need to mediate between the bureaucrats and the applicants. They act as local brokers, and they need to translate literally from what the applicant wants to do. They need to translate it in European Union language, sort of slang. Now, what I would like to say, I know I probably should finish now, is that European Union funding actually is not as simple as we like to think. It configures new political and economic subjects through intertwined vocabularies of corruption and crime, a mix of formal and informal entrepreneurial practices, and commodification of finance. This is a dynamic process. It's not as simple as it's usually presented, which essentially enables a top-down and bottom-up integration of a country into the European Union. And just last thing, European Union funding are not, and anti-corruption are not just technical solutions to technical problems. These are political processes that are based on negotiation and compromise. We know that in Romania, European Union funding has led to positive results and positive changes, but we are yet to establish their exact nature and degree. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roxana. And let us now quickly move to the last presentation by Fabio Raspadori.
I think it's better if I sit there.
Okay, because you're not going to use the...
No. Thank you. Thank you very much. My presentation will be very short because I think that all of us now are richer in knowledge, but very tired about attention. I teach European law in this department of the University of Perugia. And in fact, my presentation will be on the rule of law and how European Union conceives the rule of law, which are the method through which the European law conceives and apply this fundamental principle. Then I will pass really in a fast way to describe the situation in 4 Balkan countries and then finish. Then let me start with the notion of rule of law. I think that is very significant to read a statement from the present European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. She affirms, in the occasion of the presentation of the speech about the State of the Union in 2020, she affirms that rule of law helps protect people from the rule of the powerful, and it is the guarantor of our most basic of everyday rights and freedoms. It allows us to give our opinion and be informed by a free press. And I think that this is very important, this statement, because it shows us two fundamental aspects of this principle. From one end, it's really an indispensable instrument to consent a good relationship between the states and between citizens too. It's something that give the trust to a general system of relationship between states, but also between citizens. In this sense, it's of paramount importance to create a common area of justice, freedom, and security. That is one of the main objectives that the European Union try to perceive as enshrined in Article 3 of the Treaty on European Union. And on the other hand, the conformity to this principle, the principle of rule of law, it's essential also for a effective functioning of the European market, the European internal market. As my colleague Carlo Pieroni said, one of the important aspects of the rule of law and anti-corruption, that is part of the concept of rule of law, is the market, the well functioning of the market. If the market works well, this is a condition and a precondition at the same time of the rule of law. Then I pass to describe very briefly the notion of the rule of law, at least how it is conceived by the European Union, and the part of this conception is, in my opinion, clearly shown in the